The word communism is a word that is very controversial amongst people. The word is often seen in a negative light and is associated with unreachable utopian goals that only exist in theory, but in practice has shown to lead to economic stagnation, failure, famines, and tyrannical dictatorships. But what actually is communism? What you are probably taught at school, and what most people think it is where everyone is paid equally. Others say communism is where the government owns everything. If you were to ask most Western communists what socialism and communism is, they would say socialism is workers' control of the means of production, and communism is a stateless, moneyless, classless society. These definitions seem very simplistic and convenient, but where did the people given these definitions get them in the first place? As to have an accurate definition of what communism actually is, it seems only fair to actually look at what it has meant historically, rather than just coming up with abstract metaphysical definitions read or heard somewhere and assume reality follows from that definition, as this would not be an accurate description of the realities experienced under communism, as their experiences are what gave meaning to this word in the first place. Socialism and communism never began as an abstract definition. They began as real phenomena, and these would later be described by the terms socialism and communism. During the Industrial Revolution, workers suffered terrible working conditions, having to work long hours for almost no pay in very dangerous working conditions, and the poor had no option but to work there, as if they didn't work, they could not eat. The old traditional ways of living were destroyed, and people now had to live under massive economic instability, where it was every man for themselves, and where the old social collective binds that people used to have under the old ancient regimes were gone. This was observed by Marx and Engels, who were living in this period of modernity. To quote the Communist Manifesto, all fixed fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and options are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Many socialist thinkers started to address this social question, the first of which were the utopian thinkers such as Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Saint-Simon. However, the problem with these thinkers was that they made very similar mistakes to what lots of Western socialists today make, by thinking of unreachable utopias to advocate for, such as having no money, everyone being paid equally, becoming stateless, etc., with no basis of how they could practically be achieved in reality. The utopians were criticized by Marx and Engels, who saw that the analysis of the utopians was not based on analyzing the material conditions of the apocalypse of modernity, and so they developed their own analysis that was not based off thinking of a utopian vision where everything is perfect in unicorn land, but based on looking at the actual substance of these contradictions that had emerged and addressing these contradictions, which is what came to be called scientific socialism, and it is what distinguishes the communists like Marx, Engels, and other socialist countries that later emerged, such as the Soviet Union and China. So this association with workers owning the means of production never came from this arbitrary idea of extending one's own rights or having more freedom for the sake of freedom, as it is typically thought, but it came from the fact that workers were treated like animals with no option but to work as slaves in their own workplaces. It would be so that the production can now be based on serving social ends and improving the lives of the majority of people, rather than the pure interests of profits for capitalists while the workers live in poverty. The real promise of socialism and communism was not about people exercising arbitrary choices for the sake of control, but a more dignified human life. After all, what was the slogan for the Russian Revolution? It was not socialism, communism, and freedom. It was peace, land, and bread, giving material substances to the people that the previous regime was not able to do. The way Engels summed up what communism is as follows: communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. If this sounds vague, that's because it is. Socialist and communist theories were made about trying to understand the social question and how to address it. And so when Engels is asked, how do communists differ from socialists, he responds by giving a list of different types of socialism and says the problem of the other types of socialists and why they should be opposed, as they do not truly serve the interests of the workers. For example, the three that were mentioned in the principles of communism were reactionary socialists, bourgeois socialists, and democratic socialists. Reactionary socialists concluded that, from the evils of existing society, that feudal and patriarchal society must be restored because it was free of such evils. In other ways or another, all the proposals are directed to this end. So essentially they wanted to return to the old feudal ways of living as a response to the evils of society that existed in society. But Engels pointed out that they should be opposed as 1. It strives for something which is entirely impossible. 2. It seeks to establish the rule of the aristocracy, the guild masters, the small producers, and their retinue of absolute or feudal monarchs, officers, soldiers, and priests. A society which was, to be sure, free of the evils of present-day society, but which brought it at least as many evils without even offering to the oppressed workers the prospect of liberation through a communist revolution. 3. As soon as the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their true colours by immediately making common cause with the bourgeoisie against the proletarians. So in short, they do not have the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of the aristocracy at heart, who would end up betraying the workers whenever they start becoming revolutionary. Returning to the conditions of before industrial modernity isn't possible, as reactionaries always try to convince people into thinking. Then bourgeois socialists are the sort of social democrats that we see in existence today, with the Labour Party in Britain, or Bernie Sanders and AOC in America, where Engels said the following: what they want, therefore, is to maintain the society while getting rid of the evils which are an inherent part of it. To this end, some propose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform, which under pretense of reorganizing society are in fact intended to preserve the foundations and hence the life of existing society. Communists must unremittedly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of communists and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. So in short, they are part of the bourgeois ruling class who just want to make a few reforms but ultimately still want to preserve the society that exists today. Then there is the democratic socialists, who favour some of the same measures that communists advocate, not as part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who are not yet sufficiently clear about the conditions of the liberation of their class, or they are representatives of the petty bourgeois, a class which, prior to the achievements of democracy and the socialist measures to which it gives rise, has many interests in common with the proletariat. It follows that in moments of action, the communists will have to come to an understanding with these democratic socialists, and in general to follow as far as possible a common policy with them, provided that these socialists do not enter into service of the ruling bourgeois and attack the communists. These are the ones mentioned in the principles of communism, but there are many more, such as the utopian socialists mentioned earlier. But it is only communists who truly represent the workers and do not side with other classes like the other socialists do, and analyze society in a scientific dialectical method as opposed to the other socialists. Marx gave this description of communism: communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement results from the premises now in existence. So for Marx and Engels, and the communist states that existed, it was not some predetermined society that came from a definition that reality would follow from, as the utopians described it, but it was the working class movement that was already in existence and the process of this movement. It's clear to everyone that society today is not the same as it was back in the time of Marx and Engels, and so one might ask, what economic mode of production we have today? Is Marx's theory still relevant in the 21st century? And is there still a purpose of the Communist Party today, given how much society is different from when Marx wrote Capital. First, analysing the mode of production of society in the 20th century, Lenin saw that society was entering into a new stage of capitalism. This stage he called imperialism. The old days of free market competitive capitalism was gone, and what was emerging was the centralization into a handful of monopolies who would now dominate the economy, where bank capital and industrial capital would merge to form the financial oligarchy who operate a parasitical system of getting money from money with no products produced and the division of the world amongst the world imperialist powers. Since the 20th century into the 21st century, we have seen imperialist capitalism develop even further. We no longer live in the old form of capitalism in which small businesses can compete with each other. Instead, we have seen a greater centralization of monopolies like Amazon, who grow and grow, getting more and more powerful. We have also seen a greater number of concessions from the capitalists after the Russian Revolution and World War I. The anger of the workers grew more and more, seeing that there was no alternative to the horrific living nightmare they were faced with at the time, and so after their revolutions were crushed, the bourgeoisie were forced to give a number of concessions to the workers, such as minimum wage, universal healthcare, maximum working hours, and more regulations on the working conditions at home. They gave these concessions from the wealth they gained from their colonies, while the jobs with bad conditions were moved to their colonies who were not granted the same concessions, as well as the US funding them after World War II, as they did not want to see Europe fall to communism, so needed to fund their social democratic policies to ensure that the workers wouldn't revolt. This is the emergence of social democracy that grew in Western Europe and happened because of these bourgeois socialists that were described by Marx and Engels. Furthermore, the economic laws that currently exist have already begun transforming, with the centralization of wealth, development of technology, and contradictions of capitalism, which has led people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk and others to not only seek to grow more profits, but to also work towards producing social goals, such as Elon Musk's dream of getting to Mars. These monopolists have such a great level of wealth, in where the wealth they earn by themselves is greater than the whole GDP of many countries, so they can give money to charity to make themselves look better, or work on producing social goals in a way that under previous forms of capitalism they would not be able to do. Furthermore, a greater influence between the bourgeoisie and the states has occurred, with the capitalists having more direct control over what the government does, more bailouts from the government, and a higher level of bureaucracy. For example, the Asian tigers, who are normally associated with having free markets neoliberal systems, are in reality following a system of state capitalism or corporatism with higher levels of merging between the state and the bourgeoisie. This, as well as the fact that they were given tons of money by the Americans, is what led to the massive growth of their economies. Their success is not a story of complete free market economy, but actually a story of wealth from US aid and adopted many socialist policies. For example, South Korea in the 60s and 70s was a corporatist country where business owners were literally part of the government. They had national 5-year plans that were set up by the Economic Planning Board. They had collectivist projects like the Seymour Undone to modernize the country and get out of poverty. So it was not what you would think of the stereotypical capitalist nation. So while in the West the influence between the government and the bourgeoisie is not as much as in the Asian countries, there's still a high level of control by the bourgeoisie directly over the government, strengthening their dictatorship that has not been done in previous forms of capitalism, despite the fact that we have more democratic reforms made as concessions to the workers. For this reason, to say we live in some form of mixed economy, or socialism for the rich, is not that far from the systems that we have today, as we already have the economic laws ready for socialism, as well as concessions made by the bourgeois socialists. But society is still controlled by the bourgeoisie, who have a far larger centralization of monopolies, to the point where it has become like one central government across the country operating for the interests of profit. Given the fact that we already have all these concessions and are already living in a form of socialism, one might ask, is there any purpose for communists in the 21st century? Well, yes, there is. To start off, it is only through a Marxist scientific analysis that a scientific understanding of the world around us is possible. The fact that we already have the material basis and economic laws to govern an efficient socialist country should expose how rotten and corrupt the establishment really is. They seek to gain money, profit and power, which sets back the conditions of the people as a whole, with so barefaced an exploitation of the community by a small band of dividend mongers. We still face the same contradictions of 19th century capitalism in society. Just because the bourgeoisie gave some reforms does not mean that it fixes the problems of society, it just cures the symptoms. Just because we have a new form of society does not mean that what Marx was describing in Capital just disappeared. Rather, it transformed. The only way to truly address the systemic contradictions is you need to have a systemic revolution to have a country that truly gives socialism to the people and not socialism for the rich. The question that needs to be asked is, what really is this apocalypse that we call modernity? For starters, what needs to be examined is how people lived and the form of civilization that existed but lost under capitalism. And the thing that enabled civilizations to survive the test of time was the collective being of the people. It was a way of having a purpose in life, being able to connect with the people in your society and quite literally have the same connection between people and their means of production. Marx talks about this saying, the capitalist system presupposes a complete separation of the labourers from all property in the means by which they can realise their labour. So peasants who were once able to sell their labour through the products they themselves produced, now must be obliged to offer for sale as a commodity that very labour power which exists only in his living self. So peasants who once possessed some form of living being now became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their means of production and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And now the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. So it is this lack of living being that people in today's society lack. People lack the communal feeling rural peasants once had. This rapid increase in individualism, indulgence, and short-term orientation has led to people in the West developing some of the worst mental health problems in the world, despite their level of standard of living. This is something the status quo is not able to make sense of, and Marxism has never been more relevant than in today's society. Which is why it was only the communists who were able to revive the tradition of Russian and Chinese civilization. Given the relevance of Marxist theory to today, why is it that Marxists fail to gain any relevance? The reason for this is that they are making the same mistakes that Western Marxists have always made, which is neglecting the objectivity of living being, the very substance of the proletarian struggle, and focus on abstract theory that most people don't care about, and focus on institutionalized versions of Marxism that contains itself by rejecting any work outside the bourgeois political system. What all successful communist parties had was a touch with the masses. This is what Mao calls the mass line, and why all of them had a policy of land reform, which meant that the very increased socialization corresponding to proletization was the very means by which peasants could preserve or reacquire their lost sense of being and did not have to suffer the brutality of Anglo-Saxon modernity during their industrialization. This proletarian dictatorship gave the peasant majority of society a newfound sense of independent human dignity. This is the reason Trotsky called Stalin a vulgar democrat, or why ultra-leftists call Mao a peasant warlord. Instead, they and Western Marxists today focus on having this arbitrary plan of assimilating everyone into one big Amazon workplace while neglecting the people's particularity to flourish in new ways. In the examples of Russia and China, it was only because of this redistribution of land and property, the most fundamental means of production, communists would have never gained the trust of their own people. New forms of social ownership like the Soviet kolkhoz or the Chinese People's Communes that emerged from a mutual interaction between the state and the people would have never been possible. This interaction between the people and the state is what allowed people to not have to rely on politicians' promises, but to be able to, in the first place, cultivate a state of living being independently. They didn't just fight for free services like Social Democrats promise, and is even what most Marxists today limit themselves to in the West. It was them actually fighting for the people to have the breathing room to participate in producing the very wealth for themselves. The organization itself must become a dynamic interface between the leadership and the people. It must become more than just a party. It becomes a symbol that is able to cohere meaning across the political, cultural and digital sense. The Communist parties didn't just accomplish land reform, but became the interface by which the reform and the Cultural Revolution would be given meaning and purpose. The way that they were able to organize, produce forms of collective identification and unite people with politics is everything that the Communist parties today in the West failed to do. Although directly emulating the steps they took one by one would be ridiculous, we should instead learn from the communists such as Lenin, Stalin and Mao, and their ability to relate to the needs of the people, which represents all the qualities that are missing in social democrats and today's Western communists. Institutionalized politicians like them only promise to extend the state's failed institutions over the whole country as a remedy for the symptoms rather than relating the objective contradiction that defines the relationship between the people and their living being. Instead of making sense of the separation between the people and the state, media and institutionalized Western leftists, who are mostly made of an urban, professional, managerial class, deny it, and in oftentimes do the job of protecting the dying state or even extending it, rather than being leaders who know how to connect the longings of the people. This is what Western Marxists lack, and it is the job of all true communists who wish to make a change to the status quo. It is learning how to articulate the feelings of the people who can already see that the establishment does not serve them, and form political force made from the people and to serve the people. Communism is not some utopian promise where all problems are magically fixed, or some static arbitrary sets of policies. It is the real movement of the working class, and it is only a communist movement that can reunite the workers with their lost state of being, which is the goal of communism. Western Marxists have forgotten this. The majority of them are Trotskyists who focus on arbitrary definitions and forget the true connection between the people and the party. Others fall into reformism. They forget the class struggle and are only interested in building a coalition with social democrats and get it voted in to make reforms. They fail to recognize the class struggle and what it really means to build a revolutionary movement. It then falls to us. All communists should go back to the basics and reassess what does it really mean to be a communist, and go back to the theory. It is up to us to build the movement. Nobody is going to save us from the apocalypse of modernity, not the government, the Labour Party, or any other bourgeois force. We need to organise and unite with the working class, who we have recently seen in Britain has been becoming more and more revolutionary with the recent cost of living crisis, and it is only through going back to the basics and organising that we can work together to save the future of humanity.